But what's so great about the book of Ecclesiastes is Solomon the preacher is talking to the church, the Ecclesia, that's why it's called Ecclesiastes. And he's saying, you don't have to have a crappy life. Yes, it's true. Sometimes certain circumstances dictate what's going to happen, and you can't control those circumstances. But many times you can control those circumstances. I am really excited about what I'm going to share with you tonight. So turn with me, if you would, to the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Now remember, Ecclesiastes is talking to the church. The church is the ecclesia, the church. So he's talking to the church. Solomon refers to himself as the preacher. So if you want to look at some of the best sermons that's ever been written down, read through the book of Ecclesiastes. Yet very few people actually understand the book. But tonight I'm going to show you some interesting things. So turn to chapter 3 in Ecclesiastes, and above the chapter I want you to write, that's the way the cookie crumbles. Yes, it's okay to write in your Bible, and I truly want you to write that down. Above the chapter, write, that's the way the cookie crumbles. Now, does everyone know what that phrase means? That phrase means that's the way things happen. Yeah. And that's what chapter 3 is all about. Solomon is going to explain the way things happen in this world. Because if you understand the way things happen in this world, the world makes a lot more sense. If you don't understand the way things happen, then this world doesn't make sense. So Solomon's going to explain the way the cookie crumbles. In other words, the way things happen. Now, the reason this is a perfect title is because a cookie doesn't crumble exactly the same way every time. Some cookies break off in big chunks. Others crumble into small pieces. But no two cookies crumble exactly the same way. And life is like that. Most of us experience the same things in life. But our experiences are still unique and different. I have a career. I'm married. I have children. And most of you have a career, you're married, and you have children. But even though we've experienced the same things in these three areas, our experiences are still unique and different. But generally speaking, the things that happen in this world happen to all of us. And the way things happen are the same, but not exactly the same. Does that make sense? All cookies crumble into bits and pieces, but the bits and pieces aren't all the same. And we're going to find out that we, many times, can play a role in how the cookie crumbles, but that's a little bit later. Now, if you don't get the essence of what Solomon is saying in chapter 3, this world will drive you crazy because it won't make sense. And it will literally depress you, and ultimately, life will defeat you. But if you get the essence of what Solomon is saying in this chapter, life won't defeat you, because you'll understand, well, that's the way the cookie crumbles. In other words, that's just the way things happen in this world, and I can't change that, but it's okay. Yeah. Now, I can't jump into chapter 3 without covering a few things in chapter 2, because chapter 3 is actually built on chapter 2. It's a progression. So let me explain a few things in chapter 2 that have a direct bearing on chapter 3. In chapter 2, Solomon shared with us his personal experience of trying to find the purpose and meaning to life without God. He tried intellectualism. Yes, he studied all of these different things. And it's amazing. We don't have a record of this because it wasn't kept. But he studied botany. He studied chemistry. He studied all of these different fields of study. And that didn't bring the satisfaction that he wanted. So he tried hedonism. Does everyone know what hedonism is? I've been to Jamaica, Pastor Allen. I know what hedonism is. There's actually a resort named hedonism, I believe. But hedonism is pleasure. And we know that he tried hedonism because of how many wives and how many concubines he had. No man. Well, no man needs more than one. How's that, women? But look at how many wives and how many concubines he had. Literally, he dove into hedonism. He tried materialism. Look at all the things that he built. I mean, it's amazing to see the things that Solomon built. And he accumulated this vast fortune. It's amazing how rich he was. He was the richest man that has ever lived. And he came to the conclusion that without God, there's no meaning and purpose in life. In fact, he actually became suicidal at one point. Look at verse number 17. I'll show you what I'm talking about. You see, most people don't understand this. Before we look at verse 17, let me explain something about Solomon. Solomon wanted to know what the purpose and meaning to life was, but he wanted to do it without God, and so he tried all of these things. But here's what's interesting. In trying all of these things, he actually walked away from God. And so when we read the book of Ecclesiastes and we read the book of Proverbs, we think, oh, Solomon was this wise person. And we go back to that story where God comes to him and he asks him, what do you want? He didn't ask for long life. He doesn't ask for power over his enemies. He asked for wisdom. And because of that, God says, well, I'm going to give you wisdom, but I'm going to give you long life and wealth. And we look at that and we say that Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived. But the truth of the matter is, there was a period of time when he was a fool. Because Solomon actually walked away from God. And it wasn't until later on in his life that he came back to God. He didn't finish the way he started. In fact, I'll be honest with you, because of what Solomon did, the kingdom was split in two. That's why you had a divided kingdom. Now, knowing all of that, look at verse number 17, because at one point, even though he had all of these things, he was suicidal. Notice what he said. So I hated life. I hated life. For the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind. People, he hated life. He despised it. And rabbis say he became suicidal for a while during this period of time. But eventually, Solomon found the answer that he was looking for, and his perspective on life changed. And of course, the answer was God. Look at verse 25. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? Now, who is him? Him is God. So notice what Solomon is saying. The answer that man is looking for, the answer that I was looking for, is found in God. It's God who gives life meaning and purpose. Now, most of us don't realize that. In fact, when we're young, we think that the meaning of life is wealth, or we think that the meaning of life is power. So we go after these things, but it's not until we get older in life, and all of a sudden we have all of these things, and we realize there's an emptiness inside of me. There's got to be more to life than this. And we kind of follow the same pattern that Solomon found. But eventually he found that God gives life meaning and purpose. With God, we can eat and drink and actually enjoy life, because life doesn't end here, it begins here. Yeah. In other words, our life is not short-lived, it's eternal, because when we die, we get to go to heaven. And what we do on this earth has eternal consequences. Our works follow us on into eternity. So my life does have meaning and purpose if God is in his proper place. If God is not in his proper place, it really doesn't. And you become a bitter, owed person. And as a pastor, I see that quite often. But just because a man finds what he's looking for in God doesn't mean that everything's going to turn out rosy. And that can cause a lot of confusion, especially for new Christians. I can't tell you the number of immature Christians that are hurt and confused and are blaming God for something terrible that has happened in their life. And they'll always make this comment or something close to this. This world just doesn't make sense. You see, somewhere down the line, they got the notion or the idea that when they became a Christian, they wouldn't have any more problems, that bad things wouldn't happen to them. So when bad things did happen, they didn't understand. It just didn't make sense. And the world doesn't make sense, especially if you're going through something horrible, unless you understand how God designed this world to work. And that's what chapter 3 is all about. It helps us make sense of this world by explaining how this sinful world works. In other words, how the cookie crumbles. Yeah. So let's look at chapter 3. Now, before we begin looking at verse number 1, I want you to write in the margin of your Bible. I've already had you desecrate it by writing it over the chapter. So go ahead and write this in the margin of the Bible. Chapter 3 is for the believer. Let me say that again. Chapter 3 is for the believer. The man who has found the answer to life. And what is the answer to life? God. So chapter 3 is for the man who's found the answer to life, which is God. Now, under the title, How the Cookie Crumbles, I want you to write a subtitle. Write, Making Sense of This Perverted World. Because that's really what chapter 3 is doing. It's going to help you make sense of this perverted world. Now that you know that, we're ready to read verse number 1. The very first thing a believer needs to understand is this, verse 1. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. Now, to be honest with you, this is a horrible translation, and Calvinists have jumped on this verse to try and prove that God predestines everything that happens, and that nothing happens unless it's God's will for it to happen. But that's not what Solomon is saying, and I can prove it to you. Underline the phrase appointed time in verse number 1. Notice what it says. There is an appointed time for everything. That phrase, appointed time, is translated from the Hebrew word Ziman, and it actually means season. Notice how the King James Version translates this verse. To everything there is a season, a Ziman, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. So what Solomon is basically saying is that there are seasons of life that God has ordained. Turn to Genesis chapter 8, verse number 21 and 22, and I'll show you what Solomon is talking about. Notice what this verse says, or these two verses say. And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. Now, does everyone know the context? You should have figured it out by now. This is right after the flood. Noah's come on after the ark. He's come out and he's made his offerings to God. God puts the rainbow in the sky, and this is what he says. I will never again do this. But then he goes on. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Now, according to verse number 22, God designed the world to work on its own and to continue on its own in a never-ending cycle. In fact, that's what Solomon was talking about in chapter 1, verses 4 through 7 in the book of Ecclesiastes. Notice what Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 4 through 7 says. It says, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again and again and again and again. Blowing towards the south and turning towards the north, the wind continues swirling along. And on its circular courses, the wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. Now, do you see the never-ending cycle that God has set up? The earth revolves around the sun. And as the earth revolves around the sun, the seasons change because the earth is tilted on its axis. So if the sun's here and you have the earth here and it's tilted, as it goes around the sun, at one point the northern hemisphere is closer to the sun. But as it gets halfway around and it's revolving, the northern hemisphere is further away from the sun. So over here it was warm and hot. When it gets over here, it's cold. So this revolving around the sun causes the seasons to change. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter. The sun comes up in the east and it sets in the west. And it will do the same thing tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. And I promise you, if Jesus doesn't return, well, even if Jesus returns, it will continue to do that for another 1,000 years. Yeah. Evaporation from the ocean turns into rain clouds. The rain clouds move over to the land, it rains, and the excess water runs off into rivers. The rivers flow into the oceans, and the process starts all over again. People, it's a cycle. But the implication in Genesis chapter 8 and in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 4 through 7, is that God designed this world to work without him being directly involved. Yeah. He set it up to work on its own in a never-ending cycle. Now, that's not to say that God doesn't intervene. God does through prayer, but that's another sermon. But in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse number 1, Solomon is reminding us that God designed this world to work on its own in a never-ending cycle, and everything has a season. But the key is this. These seasons come and go independently of God. They're part of a cycle that God set in motion. And just because you're a believer doesn't mean that you can skip over the seasons of life. In other words, there are seasons to life and you will experience them. And I'm not just talking about summer and winter. We're not just talking about the weather. We're also talking about the seasons of our personal life. You'll also experience childhood for a season, but you can't stay there. Puberty for a season. Thank God it's over after a while, right? Adulthood for a season. And even old age for a season. And during these seasons of life, you'll experience good and bad. Everyone does. If you think someone has a perfect life, I promise you they don't have a perfect life. If you get to know them, that you'll find out it's not what they're putting on Facebook. Yeah. We all grow up, our parents age, they pass away. We age, our children bury us. During these seasons of life, we have good things that happen and bad things that happen. Some seasons of life will be better than others. Some will have pain and sorrow. Some will have joy and happiness. Now, that explains what Solomon meant by seasons. But what about the individual events that happen? Well, look back at verse 1 in chapter 3 and notice that Solomon continued on and he said this: there is a time for every event under heaven. Yeah. There is a time for every event under heaven. Now, I want you to underline the word time. Time is translated from the Hebrew word eighth, and it doesn't refer to a specific moment in time, such as 6:05 a.m. or 10:20 p.m. or right now it is 7:30. No, it doesn't refer to that. Instead, it refers to time in the sense that the circumstances dictate that an event is going to happen or it should happen. As an example, if I say it's time to go to the hospital because she's in labor, the fact that she's in labor is what dictates that we should go to the hospital. It doesn't matter if her due date is 2 weeks away or her due date was 2 weeks ago. She's in labor. And because she's in labor, that dictates we need to go to the hospital. Does that make sense? Now, if eighth referred to a specific time, it would mean that God has predetermined every event that happens. And Calvinists would like you to believe that that's what this verse is saying, but it's not. They many times use this. They pull this verse out and they go, see, every event has a specific time. But that's not what this verse means. You see, if Solomon was saying that God predetermines every event, in other words, that God predestines everything that happens, he would have used the word moed instead of the Hebrew word eighth. Because moed refers to a time that's appointed, whether by agreement between two parties or by the decision of one person. Let me give you two examples of how this word is used and what it refers to so you can see what I'm talking about. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 35. This is the story of David and Jonathan. David realizes that Saul is trying to kill him. Jonathan is his best friend. He's a son of Saul. And he tells Jonathan, he says, your dad's trying to kill me. And Jonathan said, oh, no, Dad would never do that. And he says, well, you find out. And so Jonathan says, well, I'll find out if Dad really wants to kill you or not. So we'll go out in the morning and I'll shoot an arrow. When I shoot this arrow out, I'll send a boy to go out to get it. If I tell you, no, it went further than what you are, I'm telling you, run. You're right. My dad wants to kill you. If I tell you, no, it's closer, it means, no, he didn't want to kill you. It's safe to come in. Now, that's the context of the story. So notice what it says. And it came to pass in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field at the time appointed. That is the Hebrew word moed. In other words, a set time. So he went into the field at the time appointed with David and a little lad with him. And again, that phrase, time appointed, is the Hebrew word moed, a predetermined time. He told David when to be at that field. You be there in the third hour. I'm just making that up. I don't know what time. But it was a set appointed time. It was the Hebrew word moed. Now, look at Leviticus chapter 23, verse number 4. Notice what this says. These are about the 7 Jewish feasts. It says this. These are the appointed times. The Hebrew word is moed, a predetermined set time. These are the appointed times of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at the times appointed for them. Now, that word moed tells us it's a preset, predetermined time. 3 times a year, at specific months, always in the same month, on the same day. You're to keep these feasts. And on these feasts, at this specific time, this is what you do. That's what moed means. Now, if Solomon was trying to say that God predestines every event that happens at an appointed time, he would have used the word or the Hebrew word moed rather than the Hebrew word eighth, but he didn't. He used the word eighth. Now, as I said, eighth refers to time in the sense that circumstances dictate that something will happen or should happen. Let me give you some examples to illustrate what I'm talking about, because you really need to understand this, because you don't understand what he's saying in Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 through 8, if you don't understand this Hebrew word eighth. So let me give you some examples. If I said that it's time to take out the trash, I don't mean that it's 7:20 and that's the appointed time to take out the trash. No. If it's empty, I'm not taking the trash out. When I say it's time to take the trash out, what I mean is the trash is full. And if you have teenagers in your house, you know what I mean by that. No one wants to take the trash out. So when it gets full, they just keep piling it on, and it kind of looks like a pyramid. And you're wondering, how in the world can you get that to balance? Kids can do it. But when a parent walks by, it looks at the trash, and says, it's time to take the trash out. It doesn't mean that, it's this appointed time to do that. No, it means that the circumstances dictate the trash is full. It's time to take it out. If I say that it's time to mow the yard, I don't mean it's 10 o'clock on Saturday, and that's the appointed time that I mow the yard. Not 9:59, not 10:01. At 10 o'clock, I hit the garage button, and out I come on my zero-turn radius mower. No, that's not how it works. If the grass hasn't grown, I promise you, I'm not mowing the yard. When I say it's time to mow, I mean that the grass has grown and it's starting to look bad, and Lisa's giving me that look. So the circumstances dictate that it's time to mow the yard. Not because it's time, because the circumstances dictate it's time. And if I say it's time to paint the house, I don't mean that every 3 years I paint the house whether it needs it or not. I do it on the first Sunday in June. No, I don't do that because that's the appointed time. If it doesn't need painting, trust me, I am not going to paint the house. When I say it's time to paint, I mean the paint is starting to peel and rain could damage the wood, and the peeling dictates that it's time to paint. So eighth means time, and this is what I want you to see. Eighth means time in the sense that the circumstances dictate that an event is going to happen or it should happen. So when Solomon says that there is a time for every event, he means that there are circumstances that dictate when certain events take place or should take place. And when those certain circumstances occur, it's time for that event. Look at verses 2 through 8, and you'll see what I'm talking about. This is really neat. There's a time to give birth. When is that time? When your water breaks, when you go into labor, and you're fully dilated. And then the nurse walks in and says, the doctor's not here, quit pushing. Women, can you quit pushing when that's happened? No. It's time is what you tell them. Well, they look at you and say, it's not time. You don't understand. The circumstances dictate it's time. And a time to die. When is it the time to die? When your organs start shutting down. Maybe because of an infection, maybe because of old age, but the organs begin to shut down, and the doctor comes in and says, you better pull in the family. It's time. He doesn't mean that I can tell you exactly when it's going to happen. He means the circumstances dictate they're going to die. There's a time to plant, a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to search and a time to give up as lost. In other words, we've searched and we found nothing. And the circumstances dictate that we need to quit searching. We've been out here for 3 weeks. We haven't been working. We're not going to find anything. You don't just say, well, we gave it 1 week. No. The circumstances dictate it's time to quit searching. A time to keep and a time to throw away. When's it a time to keep? It's still in style, women. When's it a time to throw away? You just wish you would have kept those bell bottoms, right? Or whatever it is that comes around. That would have been cool. My wife says it's never cool. I would have kept my leisure suits, but the truth is I still wouldn't have been able to fit into them. But anyways, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together. A time to be silent and a time to speak. And some of you haven't learned that the circumstances dictate if you should speak or not. And you still speak up, and you should have just kept your mouth shut. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. Now I want you to notice what Solomon is saying. He goes through this list. We started off with birth, a time for birth. In other words, the circumstances dictate that it's time for this to happen. And you can't stop it, even if you want to. When the nurse says, honey, you need to stop pushing, and you go, I can't. It's time. Yeah. There's a time to die. Certain circumstances are occurring, and there's not a thing you can do. Death is going to happen. You can't stop it. The organs are shutting down. Cancer's all through the body or whatever it is. There's a time to plant. In other words, the circumstances are just right for this event to happen. The warmth of the soil, the length of daylight, the amount of water, etc. And if you don't take advantage of that time to plant, then you're not going to harvest. No. Now here's what's interesting. Some circumstances are going to cause things to happen whether we want it to or not. Other circumstances means that we should do something, but it doesn't mean we have to. There's a time to kill, and there's a time to heal. There's a time to weep, and a time to laugh. Now, I hope you catch what Solomon's saying. He's saying, sometimes the circumstances dictate what's going to happen, and you can't stop it. Such as when you go into labor to have a baby. It's time. Or it's time to die because of your age and your health and your organs are shutting down. It's time. Sometimes the circumstances dictate that it's time to do something, but it doesn't mean that you have to do it. You should do it, but you don't have to. Just ask my wife. She says, are you going to mow the grass this Saturday? And I say, maybe. What does that mean? I really don't want to. There's 3 great football games on this Saturday, and if there's no dew in the morning, yes, I will. I'll be out there at 7:30 mowing that yard so I don't miss the football game starting at 11. Yeah. So the circumstances might dictate that I need to do something, but it doesn't mean that I have to do something. But as I said, Solomon is emphasizing that it's the circumstances that dictate when it's time for something to occur, which is very important. And let me explain why. This is very, very important. To some degree, I can actually control the number of good times I have versus the number of bad times I have by controlling the circumstances. Some of you think you're destined to have a crappy life. And you are. But not because of God. It's because of your attitude. It's because of your perspective. The truth of the matter is, you don't have to have a crappy life. Yeah. You can actually control the number of good times that you have versus the number of bad times you have by controlling the circumstances. Let me explain what I mean by that. And let's start off with a hard one. Can I control my death? Or should I say it this way? Can I control the time of my death? Can I control the time of my death? That's an easy question, yes or no? Yes and no. Listen to me. Yes, to some degree. I can exercise, and I can eat right, and I can hopefully control my cholesterol, and I can get regular checkups. I can control how safely I drive and the dangerous situations I put myself in. But, on the other hand, I can't control the aging process. So in essence, I can't stop my death, but I can affect the time of my death. Does that make sense? So the answer is yes and no. Yeah. That means I have a role to play in the quality of my life. But I can't control it completely. And that's not what Solomon wanted us to understand. Let me say that again because this is very important. That means that I have a role to play in the quality of my life, but I can't control it completely. And that's what makes this life so frustrating. Some things I can control, but other things are beyond my control. Now, most of the time, I can control whether times are good or bad, but not all of the time. So I can have more good times than bad times by manipulating the circumstances that I can control. But I can't stop all of the bad times because there are certain circumstances that are beyond my control. Does that make sense? You see, sometimes we're just thrown into situations where the circumstances are beyond our control and there's nothing we can do about it. And those circumstances dictate what time it is, not me. A family member dies. I can't control that. It's a time to weep. And I'm frustrated because I can't control that, no matter what I do. A baby is born. And the circumstances dictate, if that baby is healthy, that it's a time to laugh and rejoice. It's a time of joy and happiness. Now, how I respond to the various times I'm faced with is very important. The good times and the bad times. Because in a sense, this world is a test. Did you know that? We're living a test. How many of you like tests? How many of you have test anxiety? Maybe I shouldn't tell you. Life is a test. You're being tested right now. Oh my God, some of you are freaking out. Brain freeze, right? No, but life is a test. It's a test to see how effective I am in controlling the circumstances around me. And I'm talking about the circumstances that I can control. I can't stop the process of aging, but I also know that I'm going to get to the point in my life when you guys are not going to want me to be the pastor. Now, I know it's going to be when I'm in my 90s, but still, when I get in my 90s, there's going to come a time when you say, we've heard these stories over and over again in the same sermon. It's time for him to retire. Now, here's what's sad. At that point, I don't have the ability to make money, so all I can depend upon is passive income and Social Security. But Social Security many times is not enough to live on. So I understand that I can't stop the aging process, but I can control the circumstances. And if I start preparing for my retirement now, when I get to that point where you no longer want me, when I'm no longer able to work, I can still have passive income in because I have prepared for retirement. And they can be golden years instead of bronze years. Yeah. That's true. It's also a test to see how we're going to respond to the circumstances that are beyond our control. You know, sometimes certain things happen, you're thinking, my gosh, I did all the right things, and look what happened. My spouse still had an affair. I put away money for retirement, and the economy tanked. Lost 75% of my investments. Sometimes you do all the right things. How are you going to respond to that? You know, it's kind of sad. At the Great Depression, when the stock market collapsed, there were so many suicides. So sad that people's self-worth and their life was wrapped up in their money, in material things. So sad. I can tell you right away, they failed the test. But it's liberating to know that I'm not responsible for the things I can't control. Now, the truth is, we're going to be judged on how we respond to the various times in our life, to the various seasons, to how we respond to the events that take place because of what the circumstances dictated. Yeah. But here's what's interesting. The way I respond, the things that I do, all of those things follow me into eternity. So my life has meaning and purpose even in bad times. So we're supposed to do everything in our power, and here's what's interesting, to have a good life. 2 weeks ago, on a Sunday, I talked about the secret to having a good life. And we talked about, in order to have a good life, you have to understand certain principles, certain fundamental truths that explain how things work, and that our life is made up of various facets. Yeah. And I told you That sometimes it can be very discouraging to think that I have to learn hundreds of principles in order to have a good life. Because if in one domain of my life things are bad, but in all the other domains, is good, this one area that's bad will affect all the others. Yeah. If I'm unhealthy, if I'm sick, it affects my work. And the reason it affects my work is because if I'm sick, I can't go to work. I'm not getting a paycheck. So it begins to affect my financial domain. It can affect my marriage because now we have financial pressures. That affects my children. We begin to snap at them. So one domain of your life can affect all the other domains. So if we want to have a good life, we have to learn these principles in every domain of our life. And everyone kind of got discouraged because it's like, man, there's too much to learn. But I told you there's only about a half dozen or so principles that you need to learn in every domain of your life in order to have a good life. There's only about 35 to 40 principles to learn. And if you learn those principles, guess what? You're controlling these situations, these circumstances that dictate when something happens or when it should happen. And as a result of that, you can have a good life. This is what Solomon is telling us in the book of Ecclesiastes. We have a part to play in whether or not we experience the abundant life that Jesus promised. Yeah. So, this is the way things happen in life. This is the way the cookie crumbles. Circumstances dictate when it's time for something to occur or when something should occur. Sometimes I can do something about it, sometimes I can't. In other words, sometimes I can control the circumstances, sometimes I can't. So I can't stop what happens. Other times, circumstances dictate what I should do, but I don't have to do it. It might be time to mow the yard, but I don't have to mow it. It might be time to prepare for retirement, but I don't have to. Will I pay the consequences? Yeah. You know, maybe you should be going out on a date with your wife. Maybe you should be employing certain principles. Of marriage in your marriage in order to have a good marriage. But if you don't have to do that. But I can promise you certain things are going to happen. And those circumstances are going to dictate the event that's going to take place, which could be a divorce, could be a separation, or could just be a bad marriage. But what's so great about the book of Ecclesiastes is Solomon the preacher is talking to the church, the ecclesia, that's why it's called Ecclesiastes. And he's saying, you don't have to have a crappy life. Yes, it's true. Sometimes certain circumstances dictate what's going to happen, and you can't control those circumstances. But many times you can control those circumstances. You can spend less than you earn, save what you don't spend, and invest what you save. And as a result of that, you can be putting back for a rainy day. You can do those things. So when certain circumstances arise, it always blows my mind. Someone comes in to see me and they say, Pastor Allen, the refrigerator went out. And my car needs new tires. And they have a good job. I say, so what's the problem? We don't have the money for that. I'm going to have to put it on credit card. I know you say not to do it. We won't be able to pay it off. And they start going through all of these things. They act like, they couldn't foresee that happening. They've had the refrigerator for 25 years. You've been driving that car for 6 years. Yeah. You couldn't foresee this coming up? You can control the circumstances. You can control many of the things that happen in your life. But you have to be intentional. Now, I'm going to tell you something that I think will change anyone's life here. And you need to tell someone else this. You can determine where you spend eternity. You can be intentional. You can choose Jesus Christ. You can make him Lord of your life. You can start serving him. And I promise you, when you die, you'll get to spend eternity in heaven. Or you don't have to do that. And certain circumstances will dictate that you'll die one day. And you won't be able to stop those. You won't be able to stop your death. And guess what? If you don't accept Jesus Christ, your Lord and Savior, you're not going to heaven. But right now, you can control the circumstances that determine where you go when you die. And I'm going to give you that chance. If you're here tonight and you've never received Jesus, let me tell you, you can control the circumstances. Whether you go to heaven or whether you go to hell. That's it. That's in your hands. You can't blame God for it. It's up to you. Other things you can't control, but you can control this. So if you want to go to heaven when you die, I'm going to give you the opportunity to receive Jesus. And this is what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to say a very simple prayer. If you want to receive Jesus, just repeat this prayer after me. The prayer's not magic. Just because you say this prayer doesn't mean you're saved and get to go to heaven. But if you believe what you're praying, what you're saying, then that faith will cause Jesus to come into your heart. Your sins will be forgiven, and when you die, you'll get to go to heaven. So I want everyone to bow their heads, close their eyes. If you want to receive Jesus, just repeat this prayer after me. God, I know I'm a sinner, and I know that my sin has separated me from you. But God, I believe you love me. And because you love me, I believe that you sent your son Jesus to die for my sin. I also believe that when Jesus died, his soul went to hell to pay the penalty for my sin. And when all my sin was paid for, I believe, God, that you raised Jesus from the dead. Jesus, I want you to forgive me of my sin, and I want you to be the Lord of my life. Thank you for saving me.